background, he is internationally recognized thought leader on a mission to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases by developing the most effective decision-making strategies. He's a best-selling author. He wrote Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. So this was in 2019, so recently. Another book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide, Intentional Insights in 2017. The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. That was new in 2020. My goodness, Dr. Gleb, you've been busy. He's also, he has plans for the new abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic changemakers book in 2020. And then he has over 550 articles and 450 interviews, Inc. magazine, Entrepreneurs, CBS, Time, Business Insider, Government Executive, The Chronicle, Fast Companies. So he is out there. I am just super excited about him being a part of our meeting tonight. And then also he has expertise for over 20 years, consulting, coaching, speaking, and training as the CEO of disaster avoidance experts, and over 15 years in academia and behavioral economics and cognitive neuroscience. Sorry, I'm a little slow, the big words there. And then he's also, we can follow him on Twitter, on Instagram, and he also has a free course you can register for, a Wise Decision Maker course, which he definitely can talk a little bit more about and send us all some information on. So welcome, Dr. Gleb. If everyone can make sure they're on mute, and let's get this party started.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Jen. All right. So let's talk about the situation with the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. How do we adapt, and how do you plan for it as payroll professionals? Now, specifically, your payroll professionals in Phoenix, and this is a tough situation. I was looking up the numbers for Phoenix just before our meeting, and they're not looking good. They're really going up at a pretty high rate, and the hospital beds are pretty full in the Phoenix area. So you definitely don't want to need hospitalization right now, because apparently there's 1 or 2 beds remaining in ICUs. So the other people, they'll have to give them a lower quality of care, which will of course increase their likelihood of dying. And then once the lower quality of care, not ICU beds, get filled up, which they will, that will be pretty bad, because where are you going to put people? So this is a tough situation to be in, especially in the Phoenix area. More broadly in Arizona, it's not looking great. There's a combination of factors. I'm not an expert on Arizona in particular, but from the analysis I was looking at, it's a combination of opening up and various events being held, various activities. So I just want to warn you in particular to be especially on the watch out in the next couple of months, because cases are not going to just suddenly and magically go down. The situation will be pretty bad, especially in the Arizona and especially in the Phoenix area. So with that nice news, nice start in mind, unfortunate, sad start in mind, let's go on to talk about more broadly COVID-19 adaptation planning. I want to talk about, first of all, how various people reacted in the early stages of the pandemic. Now, probably most of you, or all of you, heard about Elon Musk. He's a very public figure. If you think about new entrepreneurs, new money, people who are leaders in Silicon Valley, he would definitely be on the top, close to the top, on the top 5, 3 people. Some people would probably put him even at 1. That he probably has the biggest Twitter following, let's say it that way. So Elon Musk. Now, on March 6th, he tweeted that the coronavirus panic is dumb. And with his large Twitter following, it had over 300,000 retweets and 1.7 million likes. So got the message out there. A lot of people believed him. In just a couple of weeks, already after the declaration of coronavirus as a national emergency here in the US, He said that based on current trends, probably close to 0 new cases in the US in April. Well, we're here in mid-June and we have over 2 million cases. Yeah, clearly not right, clearly wrong, but very influential. A lot of people listen to him. What about old money? So we're talking about new money, entrepreneurs, maybe they get exaggeration too optimistic. What about old money? People like Goldman Sachs now. Goldman Sachs, they're financial analysts and stock traders, advisors. Their goal, their credibility rests in giving good advice and making good predictions for their clients. So they estimate US GDP growth as one of the primary things they do. It's very fundamental. And they made an estimate on February 24th. They said that, hey, the second quarter US GDP growth would be 2.7%. And that was a little bit lower than they were originally assuming it would be. And that's just because of the coronavirus. They figured, well, it'll probably slightly dampen US GDP growth. What happened a couple of weeks later? So just 3 weeks later, on March 15th, they revised their estimates. They said that from 2.7% growth, it's now a 5% decline. That's 7.7%. And you're payroll professionals, you know how much the consequence of that is. I present this to other folks. They might not, sales people, they might not quite get immediately, but you understand that 7.7% decline is a huge decline. But what happened only 5 days later, on March 20th, they made another revision. Now it's a 24% decline. It went from a 5% decline to a 24% decline in just 5 days. Well, clearly they got that wrong. Clearly they made bad mistakes. Both old money and new money made bad mistakes, and as a result, most companies, most leaders, most organizations were unprepared. And this is for all sorts of organizations, whether somebody hears from university, from a lot of businesses, nonprofits, whatever, left them greatly underprepared. They underestimated the threat, and they were caught in a bad situation by the pandemic. So what they did is they turned to their emergency business continuity plans, disaster preparedness plans. People call them different names. I, as a disaster avoidance expert, I do a lot of this. I do a lot of business continuity plans. I do a lot of this disaster preparedness plans. And I have to tell you, they are not a good fit for this situation. That's not what they're for. But so many businesses are just using them, relying on them in the initial stages of the pandemic. Business continuity plans, they're great for actual emergencies. When there's a blizzard, you probably don't know what that is in Phoenix. So let's say when there's a major flooding, so if something gets flooded, and that's something common in Phoenix, but you know what I mean. When there's a major emergency, earthquake or something like that, so earthquakes. If there's an earthquake, or like let's say pretty close state over when Houston was flooded, so that's a 1 to 2 week interruption in business. That's what business continuity plans are for. They're great for that. But that's not what COVID-19 is. COVID-19 is not an emergency. Treating it as an emergency is a fundamental mistake. COVID-19 is a major disruptor. It will have long-term rolling consequences. It's a slow-moving threat. It's a high-impact threat. It's a long-term threat. That's not what the typical emergency is. So we need to treat it as a marathon, not a sprint. And typical business continuity plans are a bad fit for it. Now, we have to realize that a vaccine is the only solution. You might have heard of various medications to treat COVID-19. They're mildly effective. So remdesivir has been shown to decrease hospital stay. And there's a new study out that shows there's one more medication, that's an old medication, might be effective in, I think it was something like reducing death by 5% in people who are 5 to 10% in people who need oxygen. So that's great. And both of those medications, if they do indeed prove themselves, that's great. But obviously 5 to 10% reduction in death rate and hospital stay is not a silver bullet. Vaccine is what we need. But unfortunately, vaccine is pretty hard to get because human trials to get a vaccine, that's after a vaccine is created. So you create a vaccine, it takes a while to create a vaccine, but even after you create a vaccine, it needs to go through human trials. You need to test the safety of the vaccine. It can't have harmful side effects. Or at least too many harmful side effects. That's not good. And you need to test its effectiveness. They will take at least a year of these human trials, even if we throw all the money at it And even if we cut all the red tape and if the government shows a high level of competence, extremely high level of competence, they'll take at least a year. And so the first, you might have heard about the Moderna vaccine that went into human trials in mid-March. So that's when, if everything goes well, wonderfully, we can expect that maybe that one will be there in March of next year, but that's very unlikely. The usual process takes 4 to 5 years, so just so you know, by comparison, that's how long it usually takes. Now, the vaccine, you need to understand that most vaccines don't make it through human trials. And here we're talking about vaccines that companies took a while to create. They really tried to think about them, work on them before putting them into human trials, because human trials are incredibly expensive and effortful. However, with COVID-19, the first batch of vaccines that are in human trials, the Moderna vaccine, the Gilead vaccine, Johnson & Johnson, they were very much rushed into production. So they're even less likely to be both safe and effective. So it's very unlikely that the first trials will be successful. And then you have to realize that after the vaccine is ready, the government would need to create the process of producing the vaccine, distributing it, and actually vaccinating people. And that includes getting over anti-vaxxer fears, people who are afraid of vaccines. Right now, only, according to recent polling, only 50% of the US population would actually take a vaccine for COVID-19. So that's something that has to be overcome as well, people's fears. So let's talk about possible timelines to get on the same page about vaccine. We have an optimistic one, a moderate one, which is the most realistic one, and then a pessimistic one. Optimistic one, we'll be very lucky and something will be approved by summer of 2021. That assumes one of the first vaccines, whether the Moderna one, the Gilead one, the Johnson & Johnson one, assuming that's successful. Then we have a supremely high level of government competence. Now, as I'm sure you all know, the government did not show a high level of competence. We're talking about, of course, the federal government here, which is the one that would be involved in producing, distributing the vaccine, vaccinating people, did not show a high level of competence. It reacted way too late to COVID-19 because it could have reacted much earlier. A number of countries did react much earlier. It also didn't provide nearly enough testing supplies, so it's still not enough testing in most states. And then it did not, of course, provide personal protective equipment in nearly the numbers needed, or ventilators. So not a high level of government competence so far. We should not assume that it will be competent going forward. But if it's extremely wonderfully competent, it will take only 6 months. So we'll have most people vaccinated by early 2022 if we assume, super magical optimistic situation. Very optimistic. It was, 25%, something like that. Now, the moderate scenario. Let's talk about what moderate scenario. This is the most realistic scenario. This is likely what will happen. We'll have an approval for mass production in a range from something like end of 2022 to end of 2025. So that kind of span. And 2023 would be, from the end of 2021 to end of 2025. Approved for mass production, with 2023 being the midpoint. And then production, distribution, vaccination with a moderate level of government competence. Higher than it has shown so far, but not excellent. Well, production, distribution, vaccination will take only a year. And then most people will be vaccinated by 2024. So this is the moderate scenario. This is what's most likely to happen, the span from 2023 to 2026. With 2024 as a midpoint, 50% probability on this one. And then the pessimistic scenario. Now, we might get unlucky. We might be in a bad situation. COVID-19 might be harder to make a vaccine for than we expect. Then it will be approved for mass production only by 2026. So it will take a while. It will take 5 years to create a vaccine, get it through trials. And that is a very realistic timeline. That's how the previous vaccine, the fastest vaccine that we had in the past, took 5 years. Took 5 years to get through human trials. So that would be the equivalent. Then production, distribution, vaccination would take a year, and most people with a moderate level of government competence, most people vaccinated by 2027. So that's the pessimistic timeline. And that pessimistic timeline, like I said, the previous vaccine, fastest vaccine that we had, took about 5 years. So pessimistically, we'd say that this one would take 5 years. You might think this is too cynical. I mean, we're throwing all the resources that we have, right? But you have to realize that, we still don't have a vaccine for the flu. The only vaccine we have for the flu is only about 50% effective. It's 50% effective in reducing infection. So not that great, unfortunately. And it's possible that COVID-19 might be quite more difficult to make a vaccine for than we think. It doesn't look like it's going to be as bad as the flu, but it might be quite a bit more difficult than we optimistically think. That's why it's optimistic, right? So that is the reality of what we're facing. And I wanted to check in now for those of you who are not calling in by phone. You'll see a poll in front of you with Zoom. And you will be able to vote on this poll. So please vote on the poll for how well prepared is your organization for the moderate scenario for 2024. Again, quite optimistic compared to everything else, but for the moderate scenario, how prepared is your organization? About 50% of the people who voted, getting into the 70s now. Just a couple more people who didn't vote yet. 3 more seconds. All right. Let's take a look at the results. So under a third of the organizations are all set. Great. So you're all set. You're prepared for the moderate scenario for 2024. Great to hear. But that's under a third. Most people, just over 2/3, say that the organizations either need some improvements, and that's 56%, just over half. So they need some improvement, and that's for you to think about to the extent that you can in your role as a payroll professional, where and how they need improvement. We'll talk about that later. But we also especially need to pay attention to the fact that 13% of the people, so over 10%, say that it'll take a lot of work to prepare their organizations. That's especially something you need to be thinking about. How will you help bring this information to your leadership about needing a lot of work? Okay. Let's go on. Now, I have to say, this is not easy to hear. I mean, this wasn't easy for me when I learned about this. Like I said, I'm a disaster avoidance expert, so I do risk management, decision-making, strategic planning, and it was pretty hard for me to learn about this. When I first started looking at this, adding up the timelines, seeing the consequences, I struggle with it myself. And my clients struggle with it as well, to be honest. I have to pull a lot of people kicking and screaming all into the acceptance stage, where my clients tend to be very optimistic, leaders are often optimistic, so it's hard for them to accept that this is going to be a pretty tough several years that we deal with, at least a couple of years, very optimistically, more realistically, several years. And what I help them realize, and what helps me make sure to orient toward the future, is that the sooner we accept this painful but truthful reality, the sooner we can make the decisions that will help our organization survive and thrive in the context of this major disruption caused by COVID-19. Now, what is going to be our future until vaccine? What are we going to deal with? What is the reality? What's going to happen in Phoenix? What's going to happen around the country? We're going to have loosened restrictions. We already had the shutdowns, of course. Now, all around the country, there's loosening of restrictions. And as you can very clearly see all across Arizona, but especially in the Phoenix area, that causes an increase in cases. I mean, it would be shocking and absurd if it doesn't, right? Because you have loosening of restrictions, people are interacting more, they're spreading COVID-19 to each other, and of course, you'll have an increase in cases. Now, Arizona is at a stage where its medical system is not quite, I wouldn't say it's being overwhelmed, but the standard of care will drop. So because the ICU beds approved for COVID-19 are almost full, I think, like I said, I was reading that there's 1 or 2 beds left in the Phoenix area. That means that either future patients, and of course there will be future patients since cases are rising, the hospital's beds won't be freed in time, the ICUs, they'll have to be taken far from Phoenix for treatment which will not be great for their treatment. It's not travel, of course, or they will have to be treated in a context that they don't get the appropriate good standard of care. And that, of course, will increase death rate. We know that the death rate for COVID-19 is 0.5 to 1%. That's kind of what a lot of studies are showing. In countries with a younger population, more healthy population in general, it's closer to 0.5%. In countries like Italy, where there's an older population, less healthy population, and of course, older people and less healthy people are more vulnerable to COVID-19. And though there are countries like that, it's closer to 1%. That's the death rate. We also know that in areas where medical systems are completely overwhelmed, like northern Italy, the death rate shoots up by about an order of magnitude. So in Italy, it was something like northern Italy, the area where medical systems were truly overwhelmed, it was something like 12 to 13% at one point. So that was the death rate. That's pretty horrendous. So that's death rate is for people who can't make it to the hospital at all, who don't get any hospital treatment. Because about 5 to 10% of the people who get COVID-19, and I'm including the people who don't show symptoms, need hospital treatment. Eventually, with the increase in cases in Arizona, both the hospitals will get overwhelmed, and then most likely, at least in some areas in Arizona, there will be tighter restrictions. So there will be shutdowns, more various forms of activities, maybe mandated masks, mandated social distancing, whatever, some forms of tighter restrictions. And then there will be a decrease in cases. So that's what we're facing. That's what we're facing in the next couple to several years, from 24 to 27, from 22 to 27, somewhere in that range, depending on whether optimistic or pessimistic or moderate scenario is the case. And we're facing repeating waves of this. So we'll be facing every couple of months, we'll be facing loose restrictions increase, tighter restrictions decrease. And that's what we're dealing with. That is what our future holds, and we need to realize that. And all of that means that the world will change forever. There's going to be people's habits, norms, values, they'll all change in this context. We'll never go back to January 2020, no matter how much we want to. So many people want to get back to normal, but we'll never go there. That's not the reality of the situation. We're in a new abnormal. This is where we are. People talk about a new normal. That's not the right phrase. It assumes that things will go to normal. No, this is an abnormal. And this is what we need to realize. That's what we're dealing with for the next several years. And your role is as a trusted advisor. So you are a payroll professional, of course, and you advise people with authority on how to act, both regarding payroll, but more broadly, of course, depending on your role. You want to empower the leaders in your organizations, whether the leaders of your payroll leaders, HR leaders, CFOs, to people with whom you interact, to realize the extent of this major disruption. Most are way too optimistic. People in leadership roles, generally, the higher up they are, the more optimistic they tend to be. This is part of the nature of leadership, part of the influence of leadership. People who rise up in the leadership positions tend to be optimistic, and also leadership causes them to be more optimistic. You need to help them prepare for the uncomfortable reality that they're going to be facing. You'll help by doing so, helping them prepare for this uncomfortable reality. You'll, of course, help them accomplish their leadership goals. And in addition to doing so, you'll build up their trust in you as a trusted advisor. And that's, of course, to your benefit as well. So I want to encourage you to not plan for the optimistic scenario. Too many companies, too many other organizations, they act as though the problem will blow over soon. But there's a great phrase attributed to Vince Lombardi that is especially effective with executives because they tend to be fans, football, they're into various sports games and so on. So sports activities, hope is not a strategy, attributed to the great football coach Vince Lombardi. That's a good phrase to use as a trusted advisor. You want to prepare for the moderate and ideally the pessimistic scenario. The pandemic is a slow-moving threat, so let's talk a little bit about decision-making here. And we make very bad decisions about these slow-moving threats, unusual, slow-moving, high-impact ones, because of how our brain is wired, because of how we think. And this is my area of expertise. I've studied this for 15 years as a cognitive neuroscientist, which is a practice, the science of how our brain is structured and how that causes us to behave in certain ways, and a behavioral economist. specifically how people behave in economic situations. Our gut reactions tends to greatly underestimate such threats, and that leads to, of course, to bad decisions for our businesses. And I want to talk a little bit about me. So I brought myself, my background, just so you understand where I'm coming from. My experience, I am the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. It's a small consulting, coaching, and training firm, and we specialize in helping clients avoid disasters through making good decisions, managing risks, and making effective strategic plans. I also spent 15 years in academia as a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist, and I published in prominent peer-reviewed venues like Journal of Social and Political Psychology, Behavior and Social Issues, and so on. My clients range from Fortune 500 companies to innovative startups, and Fortune 500 ranges from Aflac to Xerox. So if you know Zappos, give me a call. I've appeared in a number of prominent media venues. Have over, as Jen mentioned, over 550 articles and 450 interviews in venues like Fast Company, Newsweek, Time, NPR, CBS News, Inc. Magazine, CNBC, and so on. And I've wrote 3 best-selling books and 1 new book, which will hopefully become best-selling. I'm best known for Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters with Career Press. The blind spots, and that's of course on business decision-making of various sorts. The blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships. That's with New Harbinger, and that of course talks about relationships and conscious bias, quite relevant to the dynamics of the protests that are happening right now, and more broadly about effective communication and relationship building. The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide published with Intentional Insights, that focuses on how do you figure out what is true when it's often uncomfortable to realize this, and help others accept the truth. Finally, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Normal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic with Changemakers books, just published right now. Hopefully it'll become a bestseller too, but this is what the presentation is based on, this new book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Normal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. So that's a little bit about me. Let's talk a little bit about decision-making, more about the framework of decision-making. We suffer from dangerous judgment errors that are called cognitive biases. That's where I'm an expert. I look at these dangerous judgment errors, cognitive biases, and how they cause our brain to make really bad mistakes. And then how we can address these mistakes, how we can debias ourselves by figuring out what are the cognitive biases that cause us to make bad decisions, and how we can take steps to address these cognitive biases. These cognitive biases stem from a combination of our evolutionary heritage, what we are wired for. Now, our instincts, our gut reactions, people tell you to go with your gut, trust your intuition, follow your heart. That's very unfortunate advice in modern professional settings, especially with slow-moving, high-impact threats like COVID-19, because our gut reactions are not wired for the modern environment. They're wired for the savanna environment. That's what our instincts are for. When we were hunter-gatherers living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, that's what they're for, not the modern world. And also the structure of our brain. The structure of our brain causes us to make certain mistakes as well, cognitive biases. One thing I really want to draw our attention on from the savanna environment is how we respond to threats, and this is very relevant for COVID-19. Our primary response to threats is the fight or flight response. That's our intuitive response to threats. That was great for hunter-gatherers, for our ancestors. The risks they faced were immediate, intense, in-the-moment threats, like saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response. When we had to jump at 100 shadows, our ancestors had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. Well, guess what? There are many less saber-toothed tigers in the modern world, but we still use that fight or flight response to respond to threats. So it's pretty dangerous to do that. We make bad mistakes when we do so because the risks in the modern world are more long-term, ambiguous, uncertain. They're much more likely to come as a notification on your smartphone from somebody who forwarded you an article about a weird disease somewhere in the center of China. That's the kind of things that threats are in the modern world, and we don't respond to them appropriately. There are specifically 3 dangerous judgment errors, 3 cognitive biases I want to draw your attention to: the normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. So let's talk about each of these in turn. The normalcy bias. Now, In the Savannah environment, it was a pretty safe bet that the future would be much like today. That was a good assumption in the Savannah environment, and that's what we should think. That's what our gut reactions cause us to believe. There'll be the cycle of seasons and so on. Things will not change. That is a pretty bad belief in today's world. Our world is majorly disrupted by a number of events, whether technology, whether the fiscal crisis of 2008, 2009, whether these protests that are happening across the nation, or by COVID-19. That leads us to forecast the short-term future like the short-term past, and we underestimate the likelihood and the impact of major disruptors. Planning fallacy. Now, we tend to be pretty confident about our plans. We feel like we make a plan, it will come true. We assume the future will go according to plan. That is a problem because often the future doesn't go according to plan. And many people right now are trying to stick to their plan on COVID-19. In the context of COVID-19, they're trying to stick to their plan about their future, whether their career plan, whether their company's strategic plan, whether their department's strategic plan. And that's a really bad idea. We underestimate problems and risks and don't build in nearly enough resources to deal with potential threats of time, information, money, of course, social capital, and so on. And finally, hyperbolic discounting. Now, hyperbolic discounting has to do with us underestimating long-term. In the Savannah environment, that was pretty good. We wanted to be short-term oriented. If we killed a mammoth, it was very important to eat as much of it meat and stuff ourselves as we could because the meat would rot. We couldn't freeze it. We couldn't really invest in the long term in that environment. So our instinct is to underestimate the long term. In the modern environment, it's not the case. We have a freezer, but we're not going to hunt mammoths. But what we can do is, of course, invest our money in a bank. We can invest in ourselves by improving our skills, professional development, as all of you are doing here on checking out this webinar. And of course, we can invest in our companies and going into the future. But we tend to underestimate the importance of doing so. And we prioritize the short term to the detriment of the long term. So this is a big problem for us as well, this hyperbolic discounting. Now, I'll want you to take a look at the polling options. There'll be another poll right now. I want to ask which of these dangerous judgment errors might be the biggest challenge for your organization in particular. So which of these would be the biggest challenge for your organization? The normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, or hyperbolic discounting? Please vote. Great, we have about half of the people voted. 70% of the people voted. I'll give people 3 more seconds. All right. Okay, so we see that of the votes, we see that planning fallacy and hyperbolic discounting got about the same votes. So 1/5 for each. They saw planning fallacy is the biggest problem, and 1/5 see the planning hyperbolic discounting. But of course, 3/5 see the remaining 3/5 see normalcy bias as the biggest problem. And it's good to be aware of which ones are the biggest problems for your organization, because that helps you understand where and how you need to target your efforts to help address this problem for your organization to the extent that you can in your role as payroll professionals, trusted advisors. All right. Let's go on to talk about dealing with these cognitive biases by preparing effectively for COVID-19. You need to make long-term changes to your plans. By you, I mean whether you as an individual in your career, if you're thinking about that, or more broadly, your organization. So your organization, your division within an organization, you need to think about years, several years, realistically speaking, not weeks, as so many people are. So let's think about how organizations can prepare. You need to make fundamental changes to your business model for a future focused on virtual interactions. That is where the future is. And that's where you need to be oriented and help the leaders in your companies be more oriented toward that. Make a commitment to virtual teams and virtual offerings. And one of the things I strongly advise my clients to do is to end their office space lease. This frees up quite a bit of money, and this is money they can direct toward things, of course, like payroll or other areas, and also professional development for their teams to enable their teams to function effectively in virtual spaces, as well as various software and hardware to enable their teams to work well in virtual spaces. Let's talk about the internal business model, what you need to change. So you want to look at internal controls as the first areas. There are 6 areas of what you want to change in your business model. Internal controls. Internal controls, of course, the first one is ensuring financial security. I'm sure as payroll professionals, you're all quite aware of that. It's going to be a somewhat of a different dynamic when you're doing that virtually than when you're doing that in person. And that is something that you want to be thinking about. And of course, especially you want to address cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The FBI has reported quite a bit more hacking going on right now because people are working at home and they're not used to following the same cybersecurity protocols that they are at work, and their software and hardware is not nearly as hardened as it would be at work. And those are things you need to help your employees address, and you need to address yourself. Adapt existing compliance practices. There are certain compliance practices that will be different in virtual context than face-to-face context. And that's something that you need to adapt to the reality in which you're facing. Then you want to pursue compliance with CDC guidelines. To the extent that you do have in-person interactions, make sure that you are compliant with CDC guidelines. It's just going beyond this. Current research shows that it's better to do much better to do 10 feet rather than 6 feet of social distancing. Also, something that research shows is that if somebody does have COVID-19 and they're in an enclosed space, their breath will eventually circulate throughout that space. So that is going to be quite a problem if you have lots of people in the office at the same time, even if they're 10 feet apart. So that's one of the reasons I strongly recommend doing virtual interactions. And revise your internal measurements. Your internal measurements of effectiveness and efficiency will need to be different when you're doing virtual teams than when you're doing in-person interactions. Motivation engagement. This is another important area that people don't tend to think about too much in virtual engagement. Before the pandemic, only 34% of the employees were fully engaged, according to Gallup surveys. That means that they were really active, really on top of things. They are problem-solving, creative, innovative. Most of the people, around 60%, so 59% or so, were disengaged. It means that they weren't actively hostile, but they just came in, did the minimum they needed to do, and left to go home, and looking forward to the weekend as much as possible. And about 15% of the people are actively hostile. They're bad-mouthing the company, ready to steal from it, and ready to leave, trying to leave, find a new job. Unfortunately, of course, working from home is not going to increase engagement. In fact, it'll decrease engagement over time. Now, the initial period was a period when there's be more excitement, more enthusiasm, rally around the flag, people are in emergency mode. That's already fading quite a bit, and engagement is dropping. There's a lack of motivation, essentially, from being near other employees. People are used to getting this motivation, and that's something that needs to be addressed. It's also, there's the additional stress of adapting to the pandemic, household life, maybe kids are home from school and so on. That's a big issue. You need to provide support and guidance to employees and advise those for whom you serve as a trusted advisor to do so as well. Effective communication, that's an area that needs to be seriously addressed because virtual communication is quite a bit more complex and challenging for people who are used to in-person communication. When you have in-person communication, of course, you have many more signals, body language, tone of voice, and so on. Now, even right now, when we're doing video conference, we're all small squares in the computer and you're still not seeing all the relevant gestures, not getting the full tone of voice. But more problematically is that when you do virtual communication, much of the communication takes place by text. in collaboration software like Trello, Asana, Microsoft Teams, Slack, and that leads to many misunderstandings where people forget that they're not expressing or reading the emotional subtones that come with body language, tone of voice. This is essential to train. So this is something that can be trained on. This is an area of professional development, and you want to train your employees on doing so, communicating effectively in virtual teams. Then resolving conflicts. This is related to, but not the same at all as effective communication. In-person interactions, face-to-face, you can notice conflicts much easier. You can see people's faces looking anxious, weird, worried, stressed, and you can address them in the moment or just in hallway conversations. You can notice them, resolve them. But in a virtual team, it's much harder to notice problems and, of course, harder to resolve them due to communication challenges. This is another area where training is definitely effective, and this is something you want to do. Cultivating trust. In a virtual team, this is something that's especially important because in office settings, it's natural to develop trust through just meeting, talking about over the water cooler about what your kids are doing, what you're doing, your vacation plans, so on. You build those relationships, you build that trust. But in virtual settings, this doesn't happen naturally. So you want to provide a venue for this. It's not a matter of training. It's a virtual venue that you need to provide. Accountability, final area. Office environments allow natural accountability where you can walk around, see what everyone is doing, connect with them, see if they seem disengaged or frustrated, worried about something, and check in as a supervisor. And also as a peer, you can pop into Bob's office and say, hey, Bob, where's that report you promised me? Well, it's going to be much harder for Bob to ignore you when you're standing there than if you send a Slack message. That's going to be much easier to ignore. So this is something that you need to create new structures to provide accountability, both chain of command accountability up and down the chain of command and peer-to-peer accountability. Then the external business model. So that's the internal business model. The external business model. There are 6 areas, again, where you want to be thinking about the external business model. Service delivery. So you want to transition your offerings as much as possible to virtual or at least socially distanced, but as much virtual as possible. So let's say if you work in manufacturing, you want your whole back-end office, all of your office workers to be as much at home as possible. I strongly recommend completely virtual. And of course, in-person manufacturing, that has to be in person, but you can do various things to do social distancing. And some will find it easier than others, of course. You want to be creative. You want to be innovative. And honestly, some businesses it may not be the best thing for them to be operating during the pandemic. This is a lot of restaurants, for example, are going to be struggling, really struggling, especially, as the restrictions, you have the loosening of restrictions, you have another wave of fear due to tightening restrictions. Of course, in Arizona, it's not simply tightening restrictions, but elsewhere, and in Arizona, it's the overwhelmed medical system. So people who initially rushed out to go to the restaurants, they will stop going there because of this fear. The restaurant business is not a good business to be in right now. This is, you might want to consider, unless you have great takeout options, getting out of that business. Relationships. You want to be able to improve your ability to cultivate relationships virtually. That means both building new relationships and cultivating existing ones with external stakeholders. And this includes clients, service providers, political leaders who are especially important right now because of the money that they're providing through the CARES Act and so on, prospects, investors, suppliers. This is an area of professional development. Just like effective virtual communication, you can improve this area through professional development. Managing disruptions. Now, you're watching this webinar, you're going to be much more savvy about the reality of the situation, but many of your external stakeholders will not, and they will not plan for the long-term impact of the pandemic. So you need to protect yourself from their failures. Shifting norms. So we talked about how norms will shift pretty drastically over this time, whether values, habits, norms, beliefs. You want to get ahead of these shifts. Think about where your business is, what you're doing, where your career is, and how you can get ahead of these shifts. For example, I helped one of my clients who was the COO of a chain of Midwestern restaurants transition to being the regional manager of a chain of grocery stores. There's not much future in the restaurant industry, but the grocery stores are doing quite well. think about unknown unknowns. Now, the pandemic was a predictable disaster. It was a known unknown. So it was something that we can predict. A number of people did predict it, talked about it. They just far from the very few people listened to them. People like Bill Gates talked about this, and a number of people did listen, but very many didn't. And you can learn to scan your environment for potential disasters, listening to people like Bill Gates, who are experts on these sorts of topics, who are looking out for the future of the world. And there's a number of venues that you can use to learn about this. And you can protect yourself against them. There are many ways of protecting yourself against the pandemic. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. Of course, not everything can be predicted. And this is an area where you can keep a cash cushion to protect yourself. That's always useful. And this is an area, outcompeting your competition, this is an area where you as a trusted advisor will help the leaders that you serve as a trusted advisor really get some buy-in into this, because they love outcompeting the competition. If you take the steps I shared, you'll gain a major competitive advantage. I can guarantee that to you. And many of your competitors will fail to adapt and they'll be stumbling. So you can take this opportunity to seize market share, to hire away good people, and so on. Now, I want you to take a look at the polling option. So we'll do another poll. Question is, how well adapted is your internal and external organizational model to the pandemic? Really well adapted, needs moderate changes, or serious revisions required? Your internal and external. Great. About 40% of the people voted. Let's give people a few more seconds. 5 more seconds. All right. So, as we can see from the results, about 20%, 1/5 of your internal and external organizational model is really well adapted. Great. So 1/5 of you really well adapted. For about 3/5, you need some moderate changes. So moderate changes to your internal and external organizational model. So that's what you want to be thinking about. And as a trusted advisor, what kind of role you can do in advising leaders of changing, and in your own area of control, what you can do to change. And of course, the 1/5 of you where there's serious revisions required, that's something to really take a major step to address this, both in the ways that you can control things and in the kind of advice you can give your leaders. All right. Now, let's talk about how you can plan for the reality of the situation, planning for the long-term impact of the pandemic. Thinking about the possible futures, 5 years out, problems, opportunities, resources, information. So possible futures. This is a way to think about what can be possibly around the corner. You want to adapt this, of course, to your own context, to your company's context, your organization's context, maybe your career context, but the basic outline has to be about the reality of the pandemic and the solution of a vaccine. And you want to invest resources according to which future might be coming up. So whether the optimistic one, vaccine by 2022, the moderate one, vaccine by 2024, or the pessimistic, vaccine by 2027, widely distributed and people vaccinated. So think about 5 years out. What will happen in each of these scenarios? What will your business, what will your career look like in 5 years? All of those scenarios, the optimistic one, the moderate one, and the pessimistic one. So think about that. That's kind of the next step. Then think about the problems that would be part of the dynamic for each of these scenarios. What would be ways that you can address them in advance? So let's say that you can address potential cyber hacking in advance by investing now into into hardening the software and the hardware of your employees at home and giving them appropriate training on cybersecurity. Or you can invest in their professional development in virtual communication so that they can address, so there's going to be less problems and misunderstandings down the road, or make a plan to resolve problems if they occur. Then opportunities. What kind of opportunities might be the case for you in each of these scenarios? Again, think of ways of bringing them about. So one of the things that a number of my clients are doing is that they are thinking about how to outcompete their competition, and they're approaching some of their prospects who they'd like to work with, but who are currently working with their competitors and saying, hey, Ms. Prospect or Mr. Prospect, I took these steps A for F to make myself pandemic proof. So if the pandemic turns out to be worse than you think or worse than my competitor thinks, then I'll be happy to provide the services that you need if my competitor happens to be unable to live up to their previous high quality. And you know what? They will be called when the situation arises and when their competitors will stumble. That's a thing that you can certainly do yourself. So make a plan to seize opportunities if they do occur, if you can't bring them around what my clients are doing. Then think about resources. What resources would you need in each of these scenarios? In each of the scenarios that you're thinking about, the money, time, information, social capital. You want to invest, you want to reserve enough resources, make a plan to reserve them. For the pessimistic scenario, I strongly recommend this. Hope is not a strategy, right? At least a moderate scenario, but ideally the pessimistic scenario. Don't plan for the optimistic scenario. It's quite unlikely that will be the case, only 25% chance. And then information. Think about what information would lead you to believe that you are in each of these worlds, the optimistic world, the pessimistic world, or the moderate world. So optimistic, moderate, pessimistic. Monitor the information closely, look at the information, and adjust your plans accordingly, according to which world you think you're going to be in. And then execute against your plans. So execute, execute, execute. All right, then that's what I wanted to share. I wanted to let you know that you'll get additional resources by email. Opportunities for a free coaching session with me as part of the resources, and 2 chapters from my new book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. I will be happy to take your questions at this stage. Please go ahead. You can unmute yourself or you can chat. So either way is fine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gleb. This was amazing. Such great information. I love the honesty, the no fluff, telling us how it is. We don't always get that from our superiors. So for me personally, it was very eye-opening and great information to have, in our pocket.
You're very welcome. I'm so glad that it's helpful for you.
Yeah.
I just have a personal question for you, if I could, Dr. Gleb. What do you, can I ask you what scenario you fit in when it comes to being optimistic or pessimistic? Just personally, am I allowed to ask you that? Where do you fit?
Of course, sure. I mean, like I said, I strongly encourage my clients to plan for the pessimistic one. I follow the philosophy of hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And, that way I won't be caught out. If it's going to be more optimistic than I want, great. Then I'm planning for, then great. I'll use the resources for that one. And if information shows that a vaccine is coming and that it looks really great, then I'll update my plans to the more optimistic one and pursue that branch of plans. But I made plans for each of them. That's the key. You want to have a plan for the optimistic one, you want to have a plan for the moderate one, and you want to have a plan for the pessimistic one. And then based on the information that's coming in, you can adjust your course, but the resources that you'll need, the pessimistic one will require more resources, right? Because the situation will be tougher. So I am reserving enough resources for the pessimistic one for myself, for my business, the disaster avoidance experts, the consulting firm that I run. So that's my plan, to reserve enough resources for the worst case, while hoping, of course, for the best. And then if it's going to turn out to be better, then I'll invest the resources elsewhere.
Thank you. I was just curious.
Of course, happy to.
Come on, guys, don't be shy.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment about the presentation, how well prepared the presentation was for us, and I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the concentrated effort that you made with that presentation. It was really fascinating to listen to you.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you so much for that kind comment. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I appreciate your effort. It was, you could tell you put a lot of effort into your presentation. It was awesome.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
Dr. Gleb, everyone's getting shy on you now.
Not a problem. Like I said, there's going to be resources sent by email, and I'm happy to have a coaching session with whoever wants to adapt it to their organization. So if there's further questions, you can ask me by email and we can chat about it. But if there's no further questions, then I will hand it over to the leadership team to finish up the meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Gleb.
You're welcome.
I don't have anything else. Does anybody else have anything they want to talk about tonight that I may have left off?
Do you just want to mention about July, Joe?
Are we going to have a meeting in July?
We are.
We are. Hey, hey, everybody, there will be a meeting in July, so keep your eyes peeled for that.
Yeah, we decided as a board, guys, that since we missed so many months, we don't usually have a meeting in July, but we're going to push through. And we actually have confirmed that another member from ADP will be speaking on the CARES Act specifically. So we're looking forward to that one.
Awesome. Look forward to that.
Yeah, we're in the depths. And as promised, our CH credits will be sent by tomorrow, just so everyone knows.
All right, if there's nothing else, then I will, again, thank you, Dr. Gleb. And we'll see you guys all next month.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Gleb.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.